I always thought loyalty at work counted for something. 10 years in biomedical research. 9 patents with my name on them. Countless late nights hunched over prototypes and lab notes. I believed it all meant I was secure. But on that Tuesday afternoon, the world reminded me how disposable even your best efforts can be. My manager sat across from me with carefully folded hands, talking about realignment and downsizing. Words that sounded like business strategy but felt like a death sentence for the life I had built. By 3:17 p.m., my career of a decade was gone. No warning, no safety net, just a polite handshake and a cardboard box filled with my things. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The drive home was silent. My hands gripped the steering wheel while my thoughts spun in circles. Maybe Ethan would surprise me, I told myself. Maybe he'd take one look at me, see the fear I couldn't hide, and offer a little comfort. That's what marriage was supposed to be, wasn't it? Partnership. I pulled into the driveway just as the lights inside flickered across the curtains. Laughter spilled through the windows, muffled but sharp enough to tell me I wasn't walking into privacy, I was walking into a performance. Inside, Ethan stood at the center of the living room like a master of ceremonies. 2 of his friends, Brandon and Kyle, lounged on the couch with glasses of bourbon in hand. The smell of catered food filled the air, roast chicken, garlic bread, nothing Ethan would ever cook himself. He turned as I set down my bag, smiling in that way that didn't reach his eyes. "Gentlemen," he announced, "this is my unemployed wife." His tone was light, almost playful, but every syllable landed like a slap. Brandon chuckled politely. Kyle avoided my eyes. I forced a smile, a thin curve of lips that didn't betray the sting in my chest. As if on cue, Margaret, his mother, appeared from the dining room with a glass of Chardonnay. She had been staying with us, to help, though her version of helping usually meant picking me apart. She took a slow sip, then tilted her head like she was delivering wisdom. "Some women just aren't cut out for real responsibility, Hannah. That's not a bad thing, it just means you're better suited for other roles." Her words carried the sting of generations of dismissal, of expectations designed to keep women small. Ethan leaned back, sipping his bourbon, his smirk widening. "Don't worry, babe. I'll handle the big stuff from now on. You can join a book club or something." The room erupted in small, safe laughter. They thought it was all harmless fun, but I felt every word press against me like stones. And yet, I didn't argue. I didn't shout. Instead, I slipped my hand into my lap, opened my phone, and tilted the screen just enough to see the numbers glowing back at me. $82 million. Sitting quietly in a trust account under my maiden name. None of them knew about the patent I'd sold. Not Ethan. Not Margaret. Not anyone. They thought I had nothing left. But in truth, I had everything. The night of the dinner party began like most evenings with Ethan me being told what was happening, not asked. He'd sent a quick text that morning. "Dinner party tonight. 8 sharp. Dress nice." No discussion. No checking my schedule. Just an order disguised as information. By the time I walked into our kitchen, he was already moving through the house like a general preparing for battle, checking the table settings, fussing with the wine selection, barking instructions at the catering staff he'd hired. I stood by the counter for a moment, watching him. It was a familiar routine. Ethan hosting meant Ethan performing. He lived for these nights, for the clink of glasses and the chorus of laughter at his stories. His career wasn't half as stable as he liked to pretend, but with the right spotlight and a glass of bourbon in hand, he could make anyone believe he was untouchable. By 7:30, the house was glowing with candlelight, every surface polished to a shine. Margaret floated in from the living room, draped in pearls and disapproval, her lips pursed as she scanned me from head to toe. "At least you put on something decent," she said, her tone implying she'd expected otherwise. I smoothed the fabric of my black dress and let her comment slide off me like water off glass. Guests began to arrive. Ethan's colleagues from the firm, a few friends from his golf club, and their wives. The house filled with chatter and perfume, the sound of ice cubes clinking against crystal tumblers. I played the part expected of me, smiling at the door, taking coats, offering polite greetings. But I felt like I was watching the whole thing through glass, separate from the spectacle. Dinner was served in the dining room, the long mahogany table gleaming under the chandelier. Ethan sat at the head, of course, with Margaret to his right and me to his left. I could see how much he loved this, the way he leaned back in his chair, commanding the conversation, his voice carrying over the clatter of silverware. And then, like it was nothing, like it was a joke he'd been saving for the perfect punchline, Ethan said it. "This is my unemployed wife, Hannah." The words dropped into the room like a stone into water, sending ripples through every conversation. A few chuckles broke out, awkward but eager, the kind of laughter people give when they're not sure if something is funny but want to stay in good graces. I felt my face flush, not from shame but from the sharp sting of betrayal. He hadn't just made me the butt of his joke, he'd stripped me bare in front of people who would carry this story back to their own dinner tables, their own living rooms. Ethan's wife lost her job. Ethan says she's useless. Margaret didn't miss her chance to pile on. She dabbed her lips with her napkin and said, "Well, dear, maybe this is for the best. Some women just aren't cut out for the pressure of serious work. You can finally focus on something more fitting." Her voice dripped with false kindness, as though she was doing me a favor by reminding the table I was, in her eyes, inadequate. Ethan laughed, raising his glass. "Don't worry, I'll keep handling the important things. She can join a book club, or take up gardening. Something safe." End quote. The table roared with laughter this time, emboldened by his lead. Forks clinked against plates, heads nodded, eyes glanced at me with amusement disguised as sympathy. But I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. Instead, I let my hand drift into my lap where my phone rested, screen dim, but ready. With a quick swipe of my thumb, I unlocked it and pulled up the banking app. The glow illuminated the underside of the tablecloth, a secret world only I could see, and there it was. The number that had become my shield, my secret weapon. 82 473 910 美元. The trust account balance hadn't changed since the day the sale cleared, untouched, waiting. My heart slowed as I stared at the digits. It was like touching solid ground in the middle of a storm, a reminder that no matter how loudly Ethan tried to humiliate me, he was the fool. He thought I was dependent on him, but in truth, I was already standing on higher ground than he could ever dream of. I slid the phone back into my lap and lifted my glass of water, sipping slowly, letting the cool liquid wash away the bitter taste of their laughter. Ethan carried on, bragging about a deal. He was this close to closing, his hands gesturing wide, his voice booming. His friends leaned in, hanging on every word like disciples before a prophet. Margaret nodded with satisfaction, proud of the son who could command a room, even if he had to do it at my expense. I sat quietly, letting them talk, letting them believe. If there was one thing I'd learned from years of research, it was patience. You don't rush an experiment, you let it play out, collecting data, observing every reaction. And tonight, I was observing. Every insult, every chuckle at my expense, every smug glance Ethan shot my way, they were all notes. Mental recordings of just how deeply he underestimated me. When the main course ended, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of checking on dessert. Alone for a moment, I leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, calm and composed. No one out there had seen the flicker of fire behind my eyes. As I carried the trays of cheesecake back into the dining room, I realized something. Humiliation only works if you accept it. And I wasn't accepting anything tonight. I would let Ethan have his little show, let him believe he'd won some invisible battle. Because the truth was, he had no idea the war had already ended, and I was the one holding the victory. By the time dessert plates were cleared and the last guests slipped into their coats, Ethan was glowing with satisfaction. He kissed my cheek in front of them all, a smug little display, as if he'd put me in my place and cemented his role as the provider, the superior. Margaret patted his arm, murmuring something about what a fine man he was. When the door finally closed behind the last guest, Ethan turned to me with that same smirk. "See? Not so bad. They all get it now. You don't have to worry. I've got us covered." I smiled back, just enough to make it believable. "I'm sure you do." What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that the very foundation he stood on was already cracking. And I was the one who had set the fault line. I climbed into bed that night, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as he drifted into sleep. He thought he'd humiliated me, but all he'd done was confirm how little he understood about me, about the woman lying silently beside him. I reached for my phone one more time, staring at the glowing numbers in the darkness. 82 million reasons to stay calm. 82 million reasons to let him laugh a little longer. Because someday soon, that laughter would choke in his throat. It happened 2 weeks later. On a Thursday morning that should have been ordinary. The kind of day that begins with the smell of coffee drifting through the kitchen, sunlight creeping in through the blinds, and the faint hum of life moving forward. But the air was different that day, sharp, heavy, carrying the weight of something I hadn't yet named. I'd been awake since dawn, moving quietly through the house, folding laundry, straightening shelves, anything to keep my hands busy, and my mind from spinning. At exactly 9 o'clock, the sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my rhythm. Ethan's footsteps carried the same self-assured weight they always did, the cadence of a man who believed every room belonged to him the second he entered. But this time, there was another set of footsteps behind him, steady and professional. When I turned, a stranger in a crisp navy suit followed Ethan into the kitchen, leather briefcase in hand. "Morning," Ethan said, his tone deliberate, rehearsed. He didn't kiss my cheek, didn't even offer me the polite smile he usually reserved for public moments. He pulled out a chair at the table like this was his stage, and he'd come prepared with lines. The man beside him set his briefcase down, opened it with a practiced click, and withdrew a neat stack of papers bound with a heavy clip. "This is Daniel," Ethan said smoothly, motioning toward the stranger. "My attorney. We've been discussing what's fair." He gestured for Daniel to slide the stack across the table toward me. The lawyer offered me a faint, calculated smile, the kind men in suits give when they think they've already won. "Fair," Ethan repeated, settling into the chair across from me. "Given how different our paths are, this is really a mercy. You should find someone who actually needs a partner." End quote. The words landed like stones, but his face remained calm, even benevolent, like he was doing me a favor. My stomach turned, but I didn't flinch. Daniel cleared his throat. "This settlement offers you clarity, Mrs. Carter. No long drawn-out process, no unnecessary drama. You'll have your clothes, your personal belongings, and a modest stipend to help you start fresh. A clean break for both of you." I dropped my gaze to the papers. My name, typed neatly in black ink, repeated line after line. The terms were stark, unapologetic. Minimal alimony, no share of marital assets, no acknowledgement of the years I had stood by Ethan while he burned through failed ventures. No mention of the bills I had stayed up nights sorting, the debts I had paid, the sacrifices I had made. In their eyes, I was walking away with nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't even sigh. Instead, I reached for the pen Daniel had laid beside the stack. My hand was steady as I signed page after page, the faint scratch of ink the only sound in the room. Their eyes flicked toward each other as my signature spread across the pages, a brief flicker of smug satisfaction passing between them. They thought my silence was surrender, that every stroke of my pen was an act of desperation. Inside, my thoughts were elsewhere. I remembered my father's voice, a memory I hadn't touched in years. He used to say, "If someone's digging a hole, don't take the shovel away. Just make sure they have enough rope to finish the job." As I signed, I realized Ethan had been digging for years into arrogance, into selfishness, into debts he thought no one noticed. All I had to do now was let him finish. When I slid the stack back across the table, Daniel gathered it quickly, almost hungrily, as though he'd just captured a winning hand in a card game. Ethan leaned back, that self-satisfied smirk spreading across his face like oil slicking over water. "You're doing the right thing," he said softly, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "For both of us." I met his eyes briefly, then let mine drop, as though the words had hit me harder than I wanted to admit. But inside, I was cataloging every detail, every bank account password I still had access to. Every property deed with my signature attached, every thread of business credit he had left tangled in both our names. "I'll start packing today," I said quietly, my voice flat, controlled. "That's best," Daniel agreed, already standing, sliding the signed documents back into his briefcase. They left together, Ethan striding out the door with his usual arrogance, Daniel trailing behind with the smug certainty of a man who thought his work was done. When the door closed, the house fell into silence. For a moment, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty chairs, the faint scent of Ethan's cologne still hanging in the air. The weight of the house pressed in around me, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I moved slowly through the rooms, pulling drawers open, sliding hangers from the closet rail. I folded clothes with deliberate care, stacking them neatly into boxes. But each time I placed something ordinary, a sweater, a pair of jeans, I tucked in something else. Photocopies of contracts. Bank statements I had kept hidden. Receipts for purchases Ethan thought I'd forgotten. Little pieces of a puzzle that would one day become evidence. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, the hallway was lined with neat stacks. From the outside, they looked like the belongings of a woman starting over. But I knew the truth. These weren't just boxes of clothes and photographs, these were ammunition. I taped the last box shut and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was calm, almost serene. No one looking at me would guess what I was holding in my hands or what I was holding back. I ran my fingers along the kitchen counter, remembering the morning's coffee, the way Ethan's voice had filled the room with hollow confidence. Tomorrow, the house would be quieter without me in it, emptier. But the echo of today's silence, the one they mistook for defeat, would follow them far longer than they realized. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant hum of traffic outside. Ethan was gone, staying at a hotel for the night, his lawyer likely advising him to give me space to process. But I didn't need space, I needed patience. Because the truth was simple, they thought I was walking away with nothing. But in reality, I was walking away with everything that mattered. The trust account buried under my maiden name. The legal clause buried deep in the title paperwork of the house, one Ethan had never noticed. The quiet, steady trail of evidence I'd been gathering for years, waiting for the moment it would matter. Ethan believed the game was over. What he didn't understand was that I'd just started writing the rules. And I wasn't done playing. The night after I signed the divorce papers, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark apartment I'd rented temporarily, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional car passing outside, and the sound of my own breath catching as if the air itself carried too much weight. Ethan believed he'd won, that he'd stripped me of everything. But what kept me awake wasn't grief, it was the memory of how I had built my lifeline long before this moment arrived. I closed my eyes, and the present dissolved. I was back in Raleigh, months earlier, standing in the lab I'd been quietly renting for nearly a year. It wasn't glamorous, bare concrete floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, and shelves sagging with parts scavenged from suppliers who never asked too many questions. But to me, that cramped room was freedom. I could still smell the faint tang of solder and machine oil, the sharpness of graphite smudged on my fingers, the bitter comfort of stale coffee cooling in paper cups. On the central workbench sat my lifeline, the prototype. It was no bigger than a paperback, sleek and unassuming, but it represented years of stubbornness, nights hunched over notebooks, and the kind of persistence that Ethan would never understand. I remember pressing the final piece into place, the satisfying click echoing in the quiet. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. My hands shook, not from exhaustion but from exhilaration. It worked. My design finally worked. The door creaked open, and Dr. Patel stepped inside, his presence as steadying as it had always been. He was 62, semi-retired, and one of the few people I trusted completely. He had mentored me when I was fresh out of grad school, guiding me not just through equations and experiments, but through the murkier waters of academic politics. When I told him I was working on something privately, he didn't press for details. He just showed up with coffee and a quiet smile, as he did that night. "You look like you've been through a war," he said, setting a steaming cup beside me. "Feels like it," I admitted, straightening my spine. "But it works. I think it really works." He leaned over, examining the prototype with the reverence of a man who understood the weight of creation. He turned it in his hands slowly, his brow furrowed, then nodded. "Do you know what this means?" I did. It meant freedom, insurance against whatever storm might come. A shield Ethan could never touch if I was careful. Patel's eyes softened. "If you're serious about protecting this, Hannah, don't file it under your married name. File it under your maiden name. Don't leave breadcrumbs. Don't give anyone, even him, a chance to claim it." His words were calm, but I could hear the warning beneath them. He'd seen what could happen when credit, ownership, and power slipped into the wrong hands. That was why, a week later, I walked into the office of Angela Flores, an attorney recommended by Patel. She was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, sharp-minded, the kind of woman who didn't waste a syllable. The moment I laid the blueprints across her desk, her expression changed, not shock, not awe, but recognition. She knew I wasn't playing with ideas. I was holding something real. This, she said, tapping the documents with one manicured finger, is worth a fortune. But if you want it to stay yours, we need to bury it deep. So we did. Angela filed the patent under my maiden name Hannah Monroe, not Hannah Carter. The address we used was the lab's, not my home. She built a trust with layers of protection, legal walls so tight even a search warrant wouldn't pierce them without years of digging. Ethan would never know. Not unless I wanted him to. I remember the afternoon the call came. I was back in the lab, grease on my hands, my hair pulled into a messy bun. My phone buzzed on the workbench, Linda's name lighting up the screen. She was Angela's partner, a patent attorney who had been navigating the paperwork for months. "Ready for some good news?" she asked when I answered. "I could use it," I said, my voice tight with exhaustion. "The patent's approved. And the sale finalized this morning. A medical tech firm out of Chicago purchased the rights. Total," she paused, as if to let me brace myself, $82 million. For a moment, the world tilted. I gripped the edge of the bench, my knees light, my pulse hammering in my ears. "Million?" I whispered, afraid the word might break if I said it too loud. "Already secured in the trust," Linda confirmed, her tone steady, professional. "Payments structured, protections in place. You're covered. But remember, the confidentiality clause is strict. If anyone tied to you tries to claim it and we can prove they found out improperly, they lose everything. Including him." I couldn't speak for a moment. My throat closed around the weight of what she'd just told me. 82 million. More money than Ethan would ever see in his lifetime, and it was mine. Entirely mine. When I hung up, Patel was still there, leaning against the workbench with his arms folded. He'd caught enough of the conversation to understand. His brow furrowed, then he gave me a look I'll never forget. "Hannah, you've just built yourself a lifeboat in a hurricane. Don't tell anyone. Especially not him. Some storms are worth watching from the eye." I nodded, though a part of me wanted to shout my triumph to the world. To throw open the lab doors and scream that I had done it, that all those late nights, all the doubts, had led to this. But instead, I let the quiet satisfaction settle in my bones. That night, after Patel left, I stayed in the lab long past midnight. I labeled the prototype, slid the design files into a fireproof folder, and locked them in the bottom drawer of a battered metal cabinet. My hands lingered on the cool steel before I pocketed the key. Outside, the city was still alive, cars moving, lights flickering, but I felt removed from it, as though I carried a secret the rest of the world couldn't see. Driving home, the papers sat on the passenger seat, the streetlights flashing across them in golden stripes. By the time I reached the house, the weight of what I had done settled over me, not as a burden, but as armor. Whatever storm was coming, I wouldn't face it empty-handed. Back in the present, lying in my small apartment bed, I let those memories soothe me. Ethan thought he had outmaneuvered me, that by dragging a lawyer into my kitchen and shoving divorce papers across the table, he'd stripped me bare. But the truth was, I'd secured my future long before he made his move. The 82 million wasn't just money, it was proof that I was never the useless woman he mocked at dinner tables. It was proof that I could build, create, and succeed without his shadow looming over me. And perhaps most importantly, it was proof that silence is not the same as surrender. I rolled over, the faint glow of the city bleeding through the curtains. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a new notification. A monthly update from the trust. I unlocked it, my eyes catching the neat row of zeros. Untouched. Untouchable. Ethan thought he'd betrayed me. He thought he'd broken me. But betrayal only works when you have something left to lose. And he had no idea I'd already won. I didn't have to wait long to see the so-called upgrade. Word traveled fast in Charlotte, especially in the circles Ethan liked to move in, the rooftop bars, charity galas, an endless parade of networking dinners where the wine flowed freely, and appearances mattered more than substance. Within 2 weeks of our amicable split, his social media was filled with her, Vanessa Green, 29, glossy hair that fell in expensive waves, the kind of wardrobe that screamed designer labels even if you didn't recognize them. She was everything Ethan thought he deserved, youthful, glamorous, and just shallow enough to laugh at his jokes without realizing he was recycling the same stories he'd been telling for years. I might have ignored her entirely if not for the text that came on a Wednesday morning. "Lunch? 1 o'clock. Cielo Cafe. Be there." The message was from Ethan, though the command felt more like a summons. I considered deleting it, ignoring him altogether, but curiosity tugged at me. If he wanted a performance, I'd give him one. When I walked into Cielo Cafe, the kind of sleek little spot with brass fixtures and floor-to-ceiling windows, Ethan was already seated. His posture was perfect, his charcoal suit pressed within an inch of its life. Beside him, draped elegantly over the chair like she was born to own the room, was Vanessa. Her smile was immediate, calculated. Ethan stood halfway, enough to acknowledge me but not enough to pull out my chair. Vanessa, on the other hand, gave me a once-over, the kind of glance that measured and dismissed in the same second. "Thanks for coming," Ethan said, gesturing toward the empty chair across from them. "I thought it would be good to end things like adults." His voice carried that faux sincerity I'd heard so many times before board meetings, the kind of tone men used when they thought they were delivering wisdom but were really just sharpening a knife. "This is Vanessa," he added, his lips curving into something smug. "She's been helping me see life differently. An upgrade, if you will." The word hung in the air, cheap and ugly. Vanessa tilted her head, offering me a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Nice to meet you," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. The waiter arrived then, sliding a cappuccino in front of me without asking. Years of habit. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the steam curl toward my face as Ethan launched into a speech about freedom, ambition, and how our separation was the best for both of us. Vanessa leaned in halfway through, her voice bright with the thrill of delivering something cutting. "It must be strange, losing your job and your marriage in the same year. But at least you'll get alimony, right? That should keep you afloat." She laughed lightly, like she was tossing me a bone. I met her gaze, calm, unflinching. "I'm sure I'll manage," I said, my tone even. I took another sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue like armor. Neither of them had the faintest idea. To them, I was the discarded wife, the woman left to scrape by on scraps. But inside, the truth pulsed steady and silent. 82 million reasons I didn't need their pity. Ethan grinned, misreading my stillness as defeat. He pivoted the conversation back to himself, talking about a golf trip he was planning, a business deal that was just about to close. Vanessa chimed in about some upcoming charity gala where they'd finally be the couple everyone expected. I let the words wash over me, my mind wandering to the safety of my trust account, to the legal fortress I'd built around my invention. And then, in her eagerness to prove she belonged in his world, Vanessa slipped. "Once the house is ours, we'll finally have the kind of space we deserve," she said casually, flicking her manicured wrist as if waving away the subject. "He's already got the financing figured out," asked Teen. I froze, not outwardly, but inwardly. The words clicked into place like a puzzle piece sliding home. The house. My house. Or at least, the one we'd shared, the one Ethan assumed he now controlled entirely. I placed my cup carefully back on the saucer. "The house?" I asked lightly, tilting my head just enough to make it look like idle curiosity. Vanessa smiled, oblivious. "Oh yes. We've been looking at decor already. Ethan says it's the perfect place to start fresh." "Ager." Ethan's eyes darted to hers, a flicker of annoyance passing over his face. He hadn't wanted her to say that. But I only smiled, the kind of smile that revealed nothing. Because I remembered something he had forgotten, a clause buried deep in the title paperwork. A small but crucial detail that required my written consent for any sale or transfer of the property. Without my signature, he couldn't do a thing. They thought they were making plans for a future built on the bones of my past. What they didn't realize was that the foundation they stood on was already cracked, and I held the final key. The rest of lunch passed in a blur. Vanessa prattled on about luxury vacations, handbags, and parties I hadn't cared to attend even when I was invited. Ethan nodded along, performing his role as provider, as if the entire world was his to buy. I stayed silent, sipping my coffee, watching the scene unfold like theater. They believed they were delivering a blow, rubbing salt into the wound of my supposed loss. But I was already standing on higher ground, and neither of them could see it. When the check came, Ethan made a show of pulling out his platinum card, sliding it toward the waiter with a flourish. Vanessa leaned back, smug, her hand brushing his arm possessively. I tucked a few bills under my saucer as a tip, stood slowly, and smoothed the front of my jacket. "Enjoy your lunch," I said lightly, my voice warm but edged with something they couldn't quite place. Ethan raised an eyebrow, suspicious, but said nothing. Vanessa offered a polite, hollow smile. As I walked out of the cafe, the sunlight spilling across the sidewalk, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Behind me, they believed I was broken, powerless, a relic of Ethan's past. But ahead of me stretched the truth the millions sealed away, the legal locks Ethan would one day discover too late, the quiet strength of a woman underestimated one too many times. And that was the moment I realized. I didn't need to fight them now. Because eventually, they'd find out the hard way. After that lunch with Ethan and Vanessa, I walked out of Cielo Cafe with the taste of bitter espresso still on my tongue and a sharper clarity in my chest. They thought they had me pegged, discarded, diminished, irrelevant. But arrogance always leaves a trail. And I'd just been handed the first thread of it. That night, in the quiet of my apartment, I sat by the window with a notebook in my lap. Outside, the city pulsed with neon and headlights, but my focus was inward. I began making lists. Assets in my name, accounts still open, properties with shared ownership. Every page filled with careful handwriting was another reminder that I hadn't been erased, no matter how much Ethan tried to convince himself otherwise. The next morning, I called Scott Whitman my financial advisor. He wasn't just good at his job, he was discreet. That mattered more than anything. "Can you fit me in today?" I asked. My voice steady, though my pulse beat hard beneath it. He didn't ask questions. 3 o'clock. My office. Back entrance. And, by late afternoon, I was sitting across from him in a small, glass-walled office overlooking uptown Charlotte. The walls gleamed with polished wood shelves, but Scott's desk was a controlled chaos of spreadsheets, legal pads, and coffee cups. He was mid-40s, graying at the temples, with a sharp mind that rarely missed a detail. He leaned back, studying me with quiet curiosity. "You're ready to make moves," he said simply. I nodded. "Not loud ones. Quiet. Layered. Everything under my name." He smiled faintly. "I like quiet. Quiet builds power." For the next 2 hours, we mapped out the future Ethan didn't know I was already living. Trust funds invested into diversified portfolios. Strategic real estate acquisitions under LLCs tied only to me. A gradual expansion of assets that didn't draw attention but grew roots so deep no one could pull them out. Every suggestion Scott made was deliberate, protective. "You could live in a penthouse tomorrow if you wanted," he said at one point, tapping a figure into his calculator. "I could," I agreed, folding my arms. "But that would ruin the story they're telling themselves right now. And I want them to believe it for a little while longer." Scott raised his brows but didn't argue. He understood. Sometimes, letting people underestimate you was the sharpest blade you could wield. It was during one of those late meetings that I stumbled across something that changed everything. Scott was flipping through a list of accounts, tracing transactions with his pen, when his brow furrowed. "Hold on," he murmured, angling the page toward me. "This credit line, why is it still open?" I leaned closer. The numbers were familiar, but not recent. One of the joint credit accounts Ethan and I had opened years ago, meant as backup funding for emergencies. I'd assumed we closed them after his string of failed ventures. But no. This one was active. And not just active bleeding. Charges stacked across the last 3 months. Luxury boutiques in New York, ski lodges in Aspen, bottle service at rooftop bars in Miami. Ethan had been swiping as if credit were cash, as if debt was a myth. My name, silent but binding, was still attached as guarantor. Scott's lips pressed into a thin line. "He's been spending like there's no ceiling. Travel, clothing, entertainment, tens of thousands." He looked up, his expression sharp now. "Technically, you're liable for this." My stomach tightened, not from fear, but from the audacity of it. Ethan had been parading his new life with Vanessa, flaunting luxury, playing provider on money borrowed against my name. The very same name he mocked at dinner parties. I leaned back in the chair, crossing my arms slowly. "Can we freeze them?" Scott studied me for a beat, then nodded. "We can, but once we do, repayment demands will trigger. He'll feel it immediately." "Good," I said. My voice was calm, but inside, a quiet satisfaction bloomed. Scott tapped his pen against the desk. "You're certain?" I met his eyes. "Absolutely." He pulled a stack of forms from a drawer, sliding them toward me one by one. Each page was dense with legal language, but I didn't hesitate. My pen moved steadily, my signature flowing across the lines with deliberate precision. Every stroke felt like sealing a door Ethan thought would stay open forever. When the last signature was in place, Scott gathered the documents into a folder and slid it across the desk. "Take this to the bank directly. They'll process it faster in person. Once it's submitted, the accounts will be locked. No more charges." "And the balances?" I asked. "Due in full within 5 business days," he said evenly. A calm settled over me. For years, Ethan had counted on me to cover his messes. Bills, overdrafts, business debts that piled high enough to suffocate. I had always cleaned up behind him, stitching holes he never acknowledged. But not this time. This time, I wasn't the safety net. I was the one pulling it away. The next morning, I walked into the corporate branch of the bank, folder tucked neatly under my arm. The lobby was cool and quiet, the kind of space that smelled faintly of polished wood and efficiency. The manager, a tall man with silver hair and a tie clip that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, greeted me with the kind of practiced professionalism that suggested nothing surprised him anymore. Until he flipped through the papers. "You understand," he said slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Once I process this, the accounts will be frozen. No further activity. And the repayment demand will be substantial." I met his gaze evenly. "I understand." And ate. He hesitated, as if waiting for me to falter, to reconsider. But I didn't blink. "Very well," he said finally, sliding the documents into a secure envelope. He made a quick phone call, his tone low and efficient. 2 staff members disappeared into a side office, returning with files that were whisked away behind locked doors. By the time I stood to leave, I could already feel the ripples spreading. Outside, the sun was sharp against the glass towers, the air humid against my skin. I had barely made it halfway down the block when my phone buzzed. His name lit up the screen, Ethan. I didn't answer. 2 seconds later, a text arrived. "What the hell did you just do?" I stopped walking, letting the crowd move around me. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't type back. The fact that he'd felt it this quickly meant the freeze was already in place. And that was only the beginning. I slipped the phone back into my bag, a small smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. For the first time in years, I wasn't cleaning up Ethan's mess. I was creating the one he couldn't escape. Quietly. Deliberately. One move at a time. I knew Ethan wouldn't stay silent for long. Men like him never do. Losing control was a foreign language to him, one he'd never bothered to learn. By the morning after I froze the accounts, my phone had turned into a steady drumbeat of missed calls and texts. Each one more frantic than the last. At first, I ignored them. There was a quiet thrill in watching his panic grow, knowing the walls were closing in faster than he could spin excuses. But by the 3rd day, he demanded a meeting. "Coffee. These are. Tomorrow. We talk." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same cafe where months ago he'd smirked across the table, parading Vanessa on his arm, introducing her as his upgrade. The same cafe where Vanessa had mocked me about alimony. This time, I decided, the script would flip. I arrived 10 minutes early, choosing a table right in the center of the room where sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching in the steam of coffee cups and the glint of cutlery. No dark corners, no privacy. I wanted him exposed, the way he had once exposed me. The waitress, a young woman with kind eyes, came by with a smile. "Coffee?" "Black," I said. "Simple. No cream, no sugar." The kind of order that didn't invite commentary. I folded my hands on the table, my bag beside me. Inside was the envelope, thick with papers, notarized and final. The proof Ethan had no idea existed. 10 minutes later, I saw him pacing on the sidewalk outside. His suit was wrinkled, his tie crooked. He looked smaller somehow, less like the man who used to stride into every room, as if he owned it. When he finally walked in, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "You need to undo what you did." He snapped the moment he reached the table. His voice was sharp, clipped, designed to intimidate. I gestured to the seat across from me, my tone calm. "Sit. Let's talk like adults." He dropped into the chair, his jaw tight. "The credit lines, you froze them. Do you have any idea what you've done? You're strangling me financially. I can't move money, can't make payments. This isn't just petty, Hannah, it's sabotage." I let him finish before replying. "It's perfectly legal. I said evenly, my voice soft enough that he had to lean forward to hear. And it's exactly what any responsible person would do when their name is still tied to accounts their ex-husband is burning through. His face flushed. You don't understand. Oh, I understand. I interrupted. Flights to Miami. Designer boutiques. Aspen ski trips. Bottle service at rooftop bars. All charged to credit under my name. You wanted freedom, Ethan. This is what freedom looks like. His mouth opened, then shut again. For the first time, I saw something flicker in his eyes, not anger, not even shock. Fear. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the silence work on him. The clink of the spoon against porcelain filled the space between us. And then, as if summoned by fate, she appeared. Vanessa. The so-called upgrade walked in wearing oversized sunglasses and a dress that probably cost more than a month's rent. She froze when she saw us, her eyes darting from him to me. For a moment, she seemed to debate leaving. But curiosity won, and she walked toward us, her heels clicking against the tile. Good morning. I said warmly, my tone edged just enough for her to recognize. It's been a while. She slipped off her sunglasses, her cheeks flushing. You two know each other? She asked Ethan, her voice tight. Oh, yes. I said before he could answer. We've met. Under circumstances I doubt she brags about. I've sprake. Vanessa glanced at Ethan, then back at me, her confusion sharpening into unease. I could see the calculations spinning in her head, the cracks forming in her glossy facade. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table. Since we're all here, maybe it's time we cleared the air. Ethan shifted in his chair. Hannah. I reached into my bag and drew out the envelope, placing it on the table with quiet precision. No dramatic slam, no flourish, just enough weight that both of them noticed immediately. What's that? Vanessa asked, her voice wary. I tapped the envelope once. This, I said calmly, is a notarized summary of the sale of my patent. Ethan frowned. Patent? His tone was halfway between disbelief and dread. Yes, I said evenly. The one I developed before we ever met. The one I sold last year for $82 million. The cafe seemed to hush around us. Conversations at nearby tables dulled into background noise. Vanessa's lips parted, but no words came out. Ethan stared at me, his face draining of color. And here's the part you'll love, I continued, sliding the envelope an inch closer. Because it was created and sold before our marriage. It's not marital property. By law, you have no claim. Not a penny. You're lying, Ethan said, but his voice cracked. You're welcome to check with my attorney, I replied smoothly. It's all there. Dates, signatures, wire transfers. Every page has one name. Mine. Vanessa's hands tightened around her purse strap. Wait, she said slowly. So you've been sitting on this the whole time? I nodded. And while we're on the subject, the credit freeze was just step one. By the end of the week, your accounts will be reviewed for unpaid debts tied to our joint name. Every overdraft, every luxury expense you thought no one noticed, they're all coming due. End quote. Ethan leaned forward, desperation edging his voice. You can't just. I already did, I said. Vanessa's eyes darted between us, panic blooming. Hold on. If everything's frozen, and you've got debts. She trailed off, but I saw the calculation plain on her face. She was realizing exactly what she'd signed up for. The rich upgrade wasn't rich at all. He was drowning. And I had just pulled the last lifeline out of his grasp. I pushed back my chair slowly, the scrape of wood on tile louder than it should have been. I stood, smoothing the front of my jacket, and looked down at them. Ethan pale, Vanessa shaken. Thank you. I said softly. For the closure. I wish you both the very best. Neither of them answered. I left the envelope where it sat and walked out without looking back. Outside, the air felt different. Lighter. The sun hit the sidewalk, the breeze carried the faint scent of roasted coffee, and I realized for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of his arrogance anymore. Behind me, the man who once mocked me as useless, was watching his empire collapse. The woman who thought she'd won, was realizing she'd inherited nothing but debt. And me? I walked away with 82 million reasons to keep smiling. The divorce finalized in less than 20 minutes. Just like that, years of marriage dissolved with the shuffle of papers and the scrape of chairs in a courtroom. Ethan stood across the aisle with his attorney, smug as ever, convinced he'd walked away with the upper hand. He didn't even look at me when the judge declared the settlement official. To him, it was over. To me, it was just beginning. I moved into a modest apartment on the east side of Charlotte the next week. White walls, a single couch, a small kitchen table, barely more than the essentials. No art on the walls, no statement furniture, nothing that would suggest the bank account behind the door held more commas than most people would ever see in a lifetime. The neighbors likely thought I was scraping by, starting over with nothing. And I let them believe it. That illusion was my shield. Only one person knew the truth, Rachel, my best friend since college, the only one who had seen me through every stage of this unraveling. She was the only one I trusted enough to know about the trust account, the investments Scott and I had been building, the carefully protected empire growing quietly under my name. Every time she called, she teased me for the act I was putting on. "You drive me crazy," she said once, laughing through the phone. "Everyone thinks you're broke, and I have to bite my tongue so hard not to scream about the millions you're sitting on." "That's the point," I told her. "Let them think I lost. It's safer that way." Meanwhile, Ethan and Vanessa's glossy life was unraveling. Word trickled back to me through whispers, through accidental tags on social media, through gossip Rachel picked up in passing. The luxury trips stopped. The new cars disappeared. Creditors began circling, debts piling faster than Ethan could spin lies. Vanessa, once radiant in designer dresses, looked drawn in the few photos that made it online. The champagne smiles had soured into tight-lipped grimaces. I didn't take joy in it, not in the way people expected. There was no thrill in watching them choke on their own arrogance. What I felt instead was distance, like I was watching actors stumble off a stage after the curtain had already fallen. Their story wasn't mine anymore. At night, I sat by my apartment window with a cup of tea, the hum of the city below, steady and unbothered. I thought about the woman Ethan tried to convince me I was: small, powerless, dependent. And then I thought about the woman I had become: quiet, deliberate, strong enough to walk away without needing applause. It was never about revenge. Revenge burns hot and fast, and then it leaves you empty. What I wanted was steadier, deeper. I wanted my dignity back. I wanted my future back. And in the silence of that modest apartment, I realized I had both. When I look back on everything, the lesson I carry isn't about money, or even justice, it's about self-worth. For years, I let someone convince me that my value depended on his approval, that I was small, replaceable, even useless. But the truth is, no one can define you unless you hand them the pen. I learned that silence doesn't always mean weakness, sometimes it's strategy, sometimes it's strength. I didn't need to scream my worth across the table or beg anyone to see what I was capable of. I only needed to know it for myself, to build quietly, to trust that my resilience and my work would carry me farther than his arrogance ever could. Life will test you with betrayal, humiliation, and loss. But those moments don't have to be endings. They can be turning points, if you're willing to stand tall in your own truth. My story isn't really about a patent or millions in the bank. It's about reclaiming my dignity, walking away with my head high, and finally understanding that my future has always been mine to write on my terms, in my time, without apology. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.